In the Grand Cathedral of 1970s rock and roll, there are names that have been etched into the stone pillars, spoken with a reverence reserved for gods: Page, Plant, Iommi, Blackmore. They were the architects of a sound that defined a generation, and among them stood the mighty Uriah Heep, a band that fused heavy metal thunder with progressive rock fantasy and soaring operatic vocals. They were giants, selling tens of millions of albums and filling arenas across the globe. We remember the charismatic frontman, David Byron. We remember the wizard of the Hammond organ and chief songwriter, Ken Hensley. We remember the relentless riff master, Mick Box. But the engine room of any great band is its rhythm section. And for a brief, glorious period, Uriah Heep possessed one of the most dynamic and innovative rhythm sections in rock history. At its heart was a figure who stood on stage like a phantom, a man with a dark, almost spectral presence. He rarely moved, rarely smiled, letting his fingers do the talking. He was the secret ingredient, the melodic soul who transformed the band from a heavy-hitting rock group into a legendary creative force. His name was Gary Thain. He is a member of the infamous 27 Club, yet his story is one that is too often whispered if it's mentioned at all. He was the prodigy from the other side of the world who became the quiet, beating heart of a rock and roll behemoth, only to be consumed and cast aside by the very machine he helped build. This is the story of the forgotten genius, the man whose bass lines were rivers of melody in a sea of rock, and the tragedy of why he was silenced too soon. To understand the remarkable journey of Gary Thain, you have to understand just how far he traveled, not just in miles, but in culture. He was born on May 15th, 1948, in Christchurch, New Zealand. In the 1950s and 60s, Christchurch was a world away from the burgeoning rock and roll revolution. It was a picturesque, conservative city, often described as the most English city outside of England. It was a place of quiet gardens, orderly streets, and a culture that was still deeply connected to the mother country, but separated by 12,000 miles of ocean. For a young man with a rock and roll soul, it was a place of profound isolation. The music that was exploding out of London and Liverpool, the sounds of the Beatles, the Kinks, the Yardbirds, arrived in New Zealand like echoes from a distant planet, delayed by weeks on vinyl pressings. To be a musician, there was to be part of a small, passionate, but ultimately disconnected scene. The dream of making it didn't mean getting a record deal in Auckland. It meant finding a way, any way, to get to London. London in the late 1960s was the undisputed epicenter of the musical universe. The bright, optimistic pop of the mid-60s was giving way to something heavier, more experimental, and more complex. The blues boom had electrified a generation of guitarists, and psychedelia had opened the door to new sonic possibilities. This was the primordial soup from which hard rock and progressive rock would emerge. Bands like Cream, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and the fledgling Led Zeppelin were rewriting the rules of what a rock band could be. It was into this fiercely competitive, creatively fertile, and intimidating world that a young bassist from the quiet end of the earth would have to prove his worth. At the same time, the band that would become his destiny, Uriah Heep, was taking shape in London. Formed from the ashes of earlier bands, they were pioneers of a unique sound. They blended the heavy riff-based power of bands like Black Sabbath with the intricate arrangements and fantasy-based lyrics of progressive rock, all topped with David Byron's quasi-operatic vocals and Ken Hensley's swirling Hammond organ. By the early 70s, they were on the cusp of major international success. But they had a problem. They had a notoriously unstable rhythm section, particularly on the bass guitar. They were searching for a missing piece, a player with not just the technical chops to handle their complex music, but the musicality to elevate it. They just didn't know they would find him in a quiet, unassuming prodigy from Christchurch. Gary Thain's musical talent was evident from a very young age. While still a teenager in Christchurch, he was already a professional musician. He and his family, including his older brothers Arthur and Dave, were all musical. Gary picked up the bass and immediately showed a natural, almost preternatural ability. He wasn't just a root note player, he had an intuitive understanding of melody and harmony. He joined a local band called the Strangers, who quickly became one of the most popular acts in the region. At just 17 years old, Gary was already a star in his small corner of the world. In 1965, the Strangers won a prestigious Battle of the Bands competition, the prize for which was a trip to the UK. This was the golden ticket, but the trip was fraught with complications, and Gary ended up making the journey to London not with the Strangers, but with a new band called Me and the Others. Arriving in London in 1966 was a shock. They were small fish in a vast, turbulent ocean of incredible talent. The band struggled, playing small gigs and facing the harsh reality of trying to make a name for themselves. But while the band didn't last, Gary's reputation began to grow. Musicians recognized his extraordinary talent. He could play with a fluidity and melodicism that was rare, especially in the burgeoning heavy music scene. His big break came when he was invited to join the Keith Hartley Band. Keith Hartley was a highly respected drummer who had played with British blues legend John Mayall. His band was a powerhouse of British blues rock known for its superb musicianship. For Gary, this was a major step up. He played on several of the Keith Hartley Band's albums, including the acclaimed Half-Breed and the Battle of Northwest 6. He toured extensively, including a performance at the legendary Woodstock Festival in 1969. Playing with Keith Hartley put Gary on the map. He was now a seasoned professional, a respected player in the very heart of the London music scene. He had conquered the city. It was during this time that his path crossed with Uriah Heep. Heep was on tour in the United States, and the Keith Hartley Band was also on the bill. The members of Uriah Heep, particularly keyboardist and songwriter Ken Hensley, were immediately struck by Gary's playing. Ken Hensley later recalled, "I saw the Keith Hartley Band play, and I was just mesmerized by Gary. He had this incredible melodic style. He was just amazing." Uriah Heep was in a state of flux. They were happy with their new drummer, Lee Kerslake, but their bassist at the time, Mark Clark, was not quite the right fit musically. They needed a player who could not only handle the thunderous driving rhythms, but also navigate the complex multi-part song structures and add another layer of melody to their already dense sound. In February 1972, they made the call. Gary Thain was asked to join Uriah Heep. He accepted, and the classic definitive lineup of the band was born. The golden age was about to begin. The impact Gary Thain had on Uriah Heep was not just significant, it was transformative. It was like adding a secret ingredient that unlocked the full potential of the band's sound. His first album with the group, 1972's Demons and Wizards, is widely regarded as their masterpiece. From the opening notes, you can hear the difference. His bass isn't just a foundation. It's a living, breathing entity, a counter melody that dances around the guitar riffs and organ swells. Listen to a track like The Wizard. A lesser bassist would have simply followed the root notes of the acoustic guitar. Gary instead plays a beautiful flowing bass line that adds a layer of warmth and complexity. On the heavy rocking Easy Livin', he provides a relentless, driving pulse, but it's a pulse with its own melodic character. He and drummer Lee Kerslake locked together to form one of the most formidable rhythm sections in rock. Ken Hensley finally had the musical foundation he needed to fully realize his ambitious songwriting visions. The band was on fire. Just 6 months after Demons and Wizards, they released The Magician's Birthday. The album was another smash hit, and again Gary's bass playing was a highlight. On the epic title track, his bass weaves in and out of the complex arrangement, acting as a vital melodic thread that holds the entire piece together. His style was unique. Unlike many hard rock bassists who used a pick for a sharper, more aggressive attack, Gary played exclusively with his fingers, which gave him a warmer, rounder, and more fluid tone. He treated the bass almost like a lead guitar, often playing high up on the neck, finding melodic spaces that other players would have ignored. The next 2 years were a whirlwind of nonstop recording and touring. They released Sweet Freedom in 1973 and Wonderworld in 1974. Both albums were hugely successful and continued to showcase the band's incredible chemistry. On stage, Gary was a mesmerizing, if understated, presence. He was tall and painfully thin, with long, dark hair that often obscured his face. He had a gothic, almost vampiric look that perfectly complemented the band's fantasy-themed lyrics. He rarely moved, standing almost motionless, completely absorbed in the music, letting his fingers fly across the fretboard. He was the epitome of quiet cool, a stark contrast to the flamboyant showmanship of frontman David Byron. But the relentless album-tour-album cycle of the 1970s rock scene was brutal. The pressure was immense. The lifestyle of a globe-trotting rock star in that era was one of excess. For a quiet, sensitive young man from a small city on the other side of the world, the lifestyle began to take its toll. Gary had started using drugs, and as the tours got longer and the pressure mounted, his use escalated into a serious heroin addiction. It was a disease that was slowly beginning to consume him, affecting his health and his ability to perform. The breaking point came on September 15th, 1974, at a concert at the Moody Coliseum in Dallas, Texas. During the show, Gary received a severe electric shock from his equipment on stage. It was a terrifying incident. He was thrown back and the band had to stop the show. He was hospitalized and the rest of the tour had to be canceled. The event was traumatic, both physically and psychologically. He was already in a fragile state, and friends and bandmates believe this incident pushed him further down the spiral of addiction. The shock had reportedly caused some damage to his heart, and he was likely using the drugs to numb not just his emotional pain, but now his physical pain as well. The golden age was coming to a dark and tragic end. Gary Thain's on-stage persona, the quiet, mysterious, dark-clad figure, was not entirely an act. Off-stage, he was known as a shy, reserved, and deeply sensitive person. He was not the boisterous, party animal rock star. Band members described him as having a very dry, wicked sense of humor, but he was fundamentally a quiet man. He was a musician's musician, someone who communicated best through his instrument. Ken Hensley, the band's primary songwriter, spoke about Gary's musical genius with a sense of awe. Gary was, without a shadow of a doubt, the most amazing musician I ever had the privilege of playing with, Hensley said in an interview. His bass playing was just phenomenal. He was so melodic, and he contributed so much. We created a space for him, and he just filled it with the most amazing stuff. This sentiment was shared by the whole band. They knew they had something special in him. He was the glue that held their most ambitious compositions together, the melodic river that flowed beneath the heavy guitars and soaring keyboards. But the disease of addiction is merciless. It doesn't care about talent or genius. As Gary's addiction worsened after the electric shock incident, he became increasingly unreliable. He would miss rehearsals, and his performance on stage began to suffer. The tight telepathic connection that the classic lineup had once shared began to fracture. For his bandmates, it was a heartbreaking situation. They were watching their friend and musical partner slowly self-destruct. This leads to the most controversial and painful chapter of the story, the band's decision to fire him. In early 1975, with a new album to record and a world tour looming, the band made the agonizing decision that they could no longer continue with Gary. He was officially dismissed from Uriah Heep. From a purely business perspective, their decision is understandable. Uriah Heep was a massive enterprise, a corporation with roadies, managers, and record company executives depending on them. They couldn't function with a key member who was unable to perform. The show, as they say, must go on. But from a human perspective, the decision is heartbreaking. This was the early 1970s. The concept of addiction as a treatable disease was virtually non-existent in the public consciousness, let alone in the hedonistic world of rock and roll. There were no high-profile rehab clinics, like the Betty Ford Center. For his bandmates, they were faced with an impossible choice. Was it tough love, a desperate attempt to give him a wake-up call, or was it an act of abandonment, cutting loose a brother in his moment of greatest need? After being fired from Uriah Heep, Gary Thain's life spiraled further into darkness. He was now cut off from the structure and purpose that the band, for all its pressures, had provided. His health, already compromised by his addiction and the electric shock, continued to deteriorate. He was fighting a losing battle. On December 8, 1975, just months after his dismissal from the band, Gary was found dead in his London flat by his girlfriend. The cause of death was respiratory failure due to a heroin overdose. He was 27 years old. He became another member of the tragic and mythical 27 Club, joining the likes of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison, who all died at the same young age. But while those artists became immortalized icons of the counterculture, Gary Thain's name has often been relegated to a footnote in rock history, a piece of trivia for hardcore Uriah Heep fans. This raises a crucial question. Why? The consequences of his departure and death on Uriah Heep were immediate and profound. The band hired a new bassist, the talented John Wetton, who had played with prog rock giants King Crimson. But the chemistry was different. The magic was gone. While the band continued to have success, most fans and critics agree that the albums they released after Gary's death, while good, lacked the innovative spark and melodic soul of the classic lineup. The golden age was definitively over. Gary Thain was, it turned out, irreplaceable. His story is also a stark and tragic cautionary tale, a human face on the dark side of the 1970s rock and roll dream. It's a story about the immense pressure, the isolation, and the dangers of a lifestyle that was glorified at the time, but which consumed so many of its brightest stars. His death highlights the music industry's historical failure to care for its artists, particularly when they are struggling with the diseases of addiction and mental illness. He was a sensitive soul from a quiet corner of the world, thrust into the very center of a chaotic, high-stakes game for which there were no rules and no safety nets. When we listen to those classic Uriah Heep records today, Demons and Wizards, The Magician's Birthday, Sweet Freedom, it's easy to get swept away by the grandiose keyboards and the powerful guitars. But if you take a moment and truly listen, you can hear him. You can hear the ghost in the machine. You can hear Gary Thain's bass, not just keeping time, but telling its own story. It's a story of incredible musicality, of intuitive genius, of a quiet man who spoke volumes without ever raising his voice. His journey was a classic rock and roll tragedy in its structure. the prodigious talent from a faraway land who conquers the big city, achieves worldwide fame, and is ultimately destroyed by the very lifestyle that fame afforded him. But to remember him as just another rock casualty, another member of the 27 Club, is to do his memory a profound disservice. Gary Thain was a musician of rare and extraordinary talent. He was the quiet, steady, melodic heartbeat of a legendary band during its most creative and successful period. His contribution was not just important, it was essential. The next time you hear a Uriah Heep song from that era, I encourage you to do one thing. Listen for the bass. Follow its fluid, inventive lines. In those notes, you will find the true spirit of Gary Thain. Not the tragic figure of his end, but the brilliant artist in his prime, a master of his craft whose music, thankfully, is immortal. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.